source number one. This was from the AP at the end of October. Slavery is on the ballot for voters in 5 U.S. states. More than 150 years after slaves were freed in the U.S., voters in 5 states will soon decide whether to close loopholes that led to the proliferation of a different form of slavery, forced labor by people convicted of certain crimes. None of the proposals would force immediate changes inside the state's prisons, though they could lead to legal challenges related to how they use prison labor, a lasting imprint of slavery's legacy on the entire United States. The effort is part of a national push to amend the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that banned enslavement or involuntary servitude, except as a form of criminal punishment. That exception has long permitted the exploitation of labor by convicted felons. Nearly 20 states have constitutions that include language permitting slavery and involuntary servitude as criminal punishments. In 2018, Colorado was the first to remove the language from its founding framework by ballot measure, followed by Nebraska and Utah 2 years later. This November, versions of the question go before voters in Alabama, Louisiana, Oregon, Tennessee, and Vermont. Memphis State Senator Ramesh Akbari also had to work with the Department of Correction to ensure that inmate labor won't be prohibited under her proposal. Proposed language going before Tennessean voters more clearly distinguishes between the two. Slavery and involuntary servitude are forever prohibited. Nothing in this section shall prohibit an inmate from working when the inmate has been duly convicted of a crime. We understand that those who are incarcerated cannot be forced to work without pay, but we should not create a situation where they won't be able to work at all, Akbari said. So it's, can we, sometimes, we have these images, from the movies of, what it looked like in terms of people, being, they're on the chain gang and they're there, with on the side of the road picking up stuff or harder labor, and it seems as if that this was a, has turned into a little bit of a complicated situation in terms of, this was headline was from the end of October. Election day saw the various ballot measures go through. Some of them were confusing. In particular, there's a follow-up article that the Alabama measure, you're basically taking away this, you want to kind of rescind this language. Well, are you rescinding the language only for criminals? Are you allowing other types of involuntary labor to take place? Parents, children, minors, other types of relatives. It's a very confusing issue, this idea of involuntary labor. And for the most part, I guess, for those of us who have the good fortune of staying out of prison, we don't have to worry about it. But we could end up in certain situations that would put in place the possibility of there being involuntary labor. The question is, what does halacha, what does Judaism say about something like this? And interestingly enough, we have certain parallels of the situation, as well as the removal or the withdrawal of permission of this type of situation. That relates to the Eved Ivri situation, right? The Eved Ivri is the Hebrew slave, right? It's very famous. The source number 2 from Shemot is describing it, that if a person steals and cannot pay back what they have stolen, he shall make restitution. If he has nothing, he shall be sold for his theft. Right? You have to, you have to pay back for what you took, and if you can't afford it, then you are an indentured servant to some extent. And this is the famous idea that you're a servant for 6 years, and after 6 years you go free. And if you don't want to go free, you get the ear piercing, and that's that famous discussion in terms of the fact that we don't like the idea of a person remaining an indentured servant. Right? If a person has to do it to pay back their debt is one thing, but beyond that, the Torah invokes later on in Vayikra the idea of avadaihem. The Jewish people are God servants. We're free people. We don't believe in being enslaved to others. We believe in being servants of God. So you have this idea of an indentured servant. Now, very famously in there is the Seinfeld episode where they develop a pilot for NBC, and the premise they go with is the fact that someone gets into a car accident and damages another person's car, and they don't have insurance. So in exchange, that person has to be the butler of the person whose car they damaged until they pay off the damage. And it's certainly an Eved Ivri type of scenario. Not surprising that, as we have seen in the Jerry Seinfeld, Larry David world of Jewish topics being addressed in like our halachos of Larry David that we had last year. But this is the Eved Ivri situation. Okay, so do we have an Eved Ivri situation today? So the Talmud tells us no. The Talmud in Erechim 29a, Rambam in the Code of Jewish Law also address this, that the sale of a Hebrew slave is practiced only during a period when the Jubilee year is observed. As it is stated, if your brother be waxen poor with you and sell himself to you, he shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Right? We have the 6th year, but then, of course, if he stays and wants to stay longer, he can go until the Jubilee year. And so the rabbis understood the Jubilee being invoked as the concrete end of this possibility as the fact that there has to be a Jubilee year in the picture for the Eved Ivri to exist. If there's no Jubilee, there's no Eved Ivri. We saw previously the idea that the Jubilee plays a role also in the whole Shemitah relevance as well. And so here it may be the fact that there is no Jubilee, no Eved Ivri. And so we don't have that classic example. Well, what about the fact that, what might we do if someone owes, what happens if someone owes money and can't pay it back, right? What kind of, is there a mechanism in place? What about, sometimes at the time you hear situations of people who don't want to pay their alimony or child support, the garnishing of wages and the like. So that may be more of a situation of, with regards to the laws of loans, but maybe is there a, let's say someone owes someone money and doesn't want to pay it back and decides, let's say the scenarios, they happen not to have to work for a living, right? They have a certain stipend, they have a certain, they're on disability or they're living off of a pension or something like that, and their needs are taken care of. But what about the fact that they owe someone money? Can we force them to work to earn income so that they can pay the loan back, right? Otherwise you can end up in situations where people could abuse their their retirement, or they're not having to work by saying, look, I'm not working, I owe you money, but I don't have any additional money to pay you. And so it's all fine and good for there to be decisions in favor of the person who's owed money, but what do we do in a situation? So there is the idea that is discussed of the debtor, right? The person who owes the money, who is not willing to work, and that situation, is addressed in this. The question is raised in the Talmud. And both with regards to a debt and with regards to the ketubah, right? We know that the ketubah document, which sometimes seems almost like pro forma, does spell out within it the fact that the husband makes a certain guarantee. Va'ana eflach va'okir. Eflach means that I will work and attach value to you and support you. So in a case like that, if a person, at least in a situation of a husband and wife situation, or if the husband divorces the wife and he is refusing to say, look, I don't have any money to pay, but the husband isn't working because the husband's collecting the pension. But the husband said, I will work to support you. Can you force the guy back to work? Can you force someone who owes someone else money? Can you force a debtor back to work so that they will earn the income to pay their requirement? So the Shulchan Aruch captures some of the opinions of this situation because it is discussed by some of the earlier authorities that, and it's source number 4 in the Hebrew will translate it, that there are those who say that a representative of the court is not allowed to force their way into someone's home to see if they have what to pay. If the time for paying hasn't come yet, right? Let's say there's starting January 1, he has to pay back. You're really not allowed to push or make any demands before January 1. But once January comes and it's time to collect, and the person doesn't want to, he says that he has nothing to pay. Then if the representative of the court kind of he kind of runs inside and sees that he does have what to pay, you can force him to pay, right? The idea is you're dealing with someone who's being a little bit dishonest. If you find out they're being dishonest, you can then force them to pay. But, and this is the bolded line, you can't force him to go back to work in order to pay. You can't, to hire himself out, is to do any kind of work, right? You can kind of do a significant forensic investigation to find out if he has wherewithal. You may be able even to, get a search warrant to enter the house or go in and find out, but you're not able to, you can't force someone to go back to work.
Rabbi, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The source sheets are not on my chat.
Let's try that again.
Sorry. Apologize. Interruption.
Let's put it up there again. Does it appear?
Yeah.
So basically, so you have in this situation with that, you can do everything you can to find out if the person has the money, but you're not allowed to. There's no way to force the person to go to work, and so what do you do in this situation? So. Going back to the ketubah situation, it could be that that some of it may have to do with kind of what's expected of the person. Maybe what is how old the person is, what are the skills of, what kind of work would it be doing, right? If the only jobs available are beneath the dignity of the person, right? Maybe you can't force him to be a butler, but if he has a skill that he can go back to work, and he's a doctor, he can see some patients. Maybe there's a way to nudge him in the right direction with regards to earn the income to pay the person back. And this is something that was addressed in a case in Israel. Source number 5 is from the rulings of the rabbinical courts in Israel, and these are the rabbis who were part of that Beit Din, Rabbi Werner, Rabbi Tena, Rabbi Epstein, dealing with a case where money was owed, and they're invoking this idea that you can't force, but maybe, and they invoke the idea in a case where money is owed, like the ketubah precedent, that it all depends that what's ragil. Right, it all depends on ba'avodah haragil ba'lavod. Right, it depends what is the usual type of work. Maybe if there's an accessible, reasonable form of work that a person can do, that maybe they're no longer working, but it would be somewhat straightforward for them. Maybe something in the service industry. Usually they're a consultant or they're a therapist or something like that. Then maybe Rabbeinu Tam Modesh Yesh Lakofa Al Kach Sheyamshich Ba'avoda Al Manas Lefarnesis Tishno Vanav. In the case of the ketubah, maybe you could force him to work in this type of a situation. The idea of it's really only in a situation where he steals and cannot repay, where you have the Eved Ivri situation. Right, but if you have a situation that he didn't steal, he owes, like his wife or a loan, well, the Eved Ivri situation is the prototype of a case where we can force a person to work to repay their debt. Great. We don't have an Eved Ivri situation anymore because the Talmud explicitly says no Yovel, no Eved Ivri. So does that mean every single person, every single debtor is stuck? Does that mean every wife can't be collecting from her husband's ketubah? Does that mean every lender can't collect? No, it's only in that situation where he steals and would be sold for his theft, where we can no longer invoke that type of a scenario or make any force him to do it. But maybe in a case for his wife, we could do it. and if we have this possibility in the situation where the husband owes the wife her support, maybe we could also look at a situation of where a person owes other types of obligations. Again, the theft situation you can't force because that's too much like a Hebrew slave, no Yovel, no Eved Ivri. But maybe with regards to his payback, then is the last two lines of source number 5. Al habeit din levarer et haefsharut shel halova l'salek hacho. You have to do an evaluation. What are some of the ways to remove the obligation? And if you don't have to, and if there's a ways to, you might not be able to force him, but maybe there's a ways to lead him to find creative ways for him to pay back the loan. And this is based on a Rabbeinu Asher, the Rush, and source number 6. Just as we hermeneutically derive for his theft, but not for his scheming testimony for his double payment, right? The idea that you can only sell, you only have the Eved Ivri situation when there is when there's a theft. We say, but not for the payment of his debt provisions of his wife. So, right, those are two different scenarios. The Eved Ivri situation, when he is sold, it's because of theft. When you have other obligations, well, maybe there are other ways to evaluate, and we could approach forcing him to pay or obligating him to pay from different requirements, like what he writes in his ketubah, or the Beit Din should investigate. So essentially, if you would agree to be the butler, then that's a way to make it happen. Or if there are other ways to convince, or there are other types of suggestions or pressures that can be applied, we would try to do it. But it seems that this idea of that there is this impediment to forcing people to work to repay an obligation in a situation where we don't have the Yovel anymore. It could be stuck. That's that's trying to approach it from the front door, right? Person owes money, doesn't want to pay it, doesn't have a job, can't garnish the wages. We seem to be stuck from the Eved Ivri approach from going forward. We may be able to use the back door of a ketubah or some type of encouragement, but we're kind of stuck. Now, as we have seen in other situations, sometimes the rabbinic approach will try and be a little bit more broad, because this will leaves us, at least leaves me feeling a little bit bad taste in the mouth. Basically, what you're telling me, we're stuck, or the guy gets off the hook. There's no mechanism in place. Especially look at it. Secular law seems to have a remedy, right? A guy, if a person is in jail, you can make him work. So is that cruel and unusual punishment? No. How come there's no halachic recourse here? So the Talmud above Mitzia maybe opens up kind of a back door. It's similar to that in criminal situations, criminal cases. Judaism, for example, doesn't have prison as one of the punishments, right? We know that there's the death penalty, there are lashes, there's certain types of punishments, but it doesn't have prison. But then the Talmud in Sanhedrin talks about that. Wait a second, how are we going to let people completely off the hook? People who do terrible things that you don't have two witnesses that can convict them, they're just going to get off the hook. So there's this idea of extrajudicial authority. And so maybe we have that type of an approach in this case as well. Talmud above Mitzia, source number 7. Rav Soram, the brother of Rava, would forcibly seize people who were not acting properly and have them carry Rava's chair. He'd put him to work. Rava said, you acted correctly. As we learned, if you see a Jew who does not behave properly, from where does it derive that you're permitted to have him work as a slave? The pasuk says, of them you may take your slaves forever, over and over your brothers. It's derived from the conjunctive and, linking the two clauses of the pasuk. There are circumstances in which it's permitted to treat a fellow Jew as if he were a slave. One might have thought this is halacha even if a Jew acts properly. To counter this, the pasuk continues, over your brothers, the Bnei Yisrael, you shall not rule one over another with rigor. Right, so there's the idea, basically, guy's not acting properly. So Ram puts him to work. So and we learn this from the fact that, look, the Torah does recognize the concept of an Eved Ivri, of the Hebrew slave. Torah also recognizes the idea of slavery, that you are allowed to own a non-Jewish slave. Obviously, the laws of the land will get in the way of that, as well as the fact that Jewish slavery puts a lot of responsibilities and obligations on the owner of the slave to treat those slaves correctly. And as much as slavery these days is completely rejected by society, maybe some radical, primitive exceptions or criminal exceptions, but for the most part, Judaism does allow. At the same time, because of the fact that Judaism allows slavery, there does seem to be at times where the person is acting improperly, that the rabbis, from kind of an extrajudicial law and order approach, make him work. Again, carrying the chair is not the same as digging ditches, but the idea exists, and Rava says to Rav, so Rav, you acted properly. And this is actually codified in Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law, source number 8, Yoredea 267:15. When Jewish people do not conduct themselves in appropriate manner, it's permissible to impose one's authority over them by force and subjugate them. You put them to work. Now, you notice that the other source we saw from Shulchan Aruch was Choshen Mishpat. Those are the laws of commerce, right? From a commercial perspective, there's no way from a financial law perspective, there's no way to force the person to work to collect the money. But Yoredea is where we talk about what's permitted and what's forbidden. It's from a religious perspective, you can put the person to work. It's kind of interesting that at the end of the day, we may be putting the person to work, but we're not putting them to work for the financial reason. We're putting them to work from the religious behavior reason, right? Yoredea is where we talk about the laws of kosher and laws of ritual objects. So it's we're not able to charge him on the front end, go through the front door, but here we're going through the back door. And that's how we're able to collect in this type of a situation. And the Rambam, in a sense, recognizes the idea that this is kind of an idea known as Mishpat HaMelech. It's when the king decrees something, right? The fact that there's no religious, there's no Talmudic interpretation or understanding or template for how we should impose this type of a punishment or this type of sentence on the person who owes the money. Or, but if he's refusing to repay, he's not acting in a proper religious fashion. And acting in proper religious fashion, put him to work to collect the money. But how do you get from point A to point B? You can't collect it financially. He's not acting proper religiously. How do we then use his improper behavior to facilitate the rabbis putting that person to work? So this is where the Rambam takes the term that is adopted by Jewish law, the idea of Mishpat HaMelech. When the king decrees something, or when you're able to invoke, when the ruler or the law of the land is able to impose obligations on people, that's recognized Jewishly also as binding. Source number 9. When a king decrees that anyone who does not pay the fixed head tax should be enslaved to the person who pays that head tax for him, a person who pays the head tax for someone may use that person for labor beyond the ordinary measure. Right? This is basically, Rambam saying applies to Jews as well. He may not, however, use them like a Canaanite slave. If, however, a person does not conduct himself properly, he may use them as a slave. Right? If this is kind of the law of the land, the law that's on the books that allows for people to be forced into service in order to repay a debt, well, guess what? Jewish law will recognize that as valid also, not from a commercial or financial perspective, but from a law and order perspective, from a Mishpat HaMelech perspective, from a behavioral standpoint. And so therefore, it's kind of as long as this is a law that's out there on the books, Jewish law recognize it as well, not because it's a Jewish law, but because it's the response, it's the governmental response to someone not behaving properly, and therefore Jewish law recognizes that as well. So if you talk about the situation about people who have been sent to jail for not acting properly and then are going to be put to work in jail, that definitely would be recognized as something that Jewish law would see as appropriate, as valid, as correct, and certainly as legal. As we saw in the beginning, a lot of the ballot measures about how this would be regulated, from a state law, ended up in all types of confusing languages. But at the end of the day, the practice, was carved out even from the 13th Amendment as possible, looking at prisoners almost as slaves when it comes to making them work because of the fact that they're criminals. Jewish law has the Evet Ivri. We don't have the Evet Ivri as practical anymore when it comes to forcing a person to pay or to repay their obligations. There are certain technical halachic impediments to doing that. It may be more relevant in the case of a husband who owes his wife or an ex-wife money because of the ketubah, but even there, the forcing becomes tricky. So instead, we use the side door of the fact that if a person is grossly ignoring their obligations, which means they're not acting properly, they can be put to work. They can be forced to put to work, especially if this is understood as a response to egregious behavior in general. And so then the Jewish law will jump on that bandwagon as well. And that's how we'll try to collect. Questions, comments, or reactions? Okay. So the one thing I wanted to circle back about has to do with, it's a tangent, but it has to do with this idea of Judaism looking at slavery, and in particular, there is a there was a case that I remember reading an article about a long time ago, that especially we're talking all about slaves. We're talking about there's no such thing as an Evet Ivri, and when we talk about a Hebrew slave, but what about the idea of a non-Jewish slave, an Evet Kanani? The law is on the books halachically that it's allowed. We no longer have the capacity to obviously do it because it's illegal. But just what about the concept? What about the status of Evet Kanani? And it has to do with the situation. It's addressed in source number 10. It is a quite far out case in Jewish law, but it is a case in Jewish law where the rabbis addressing it do try to revisit the idea of the status of slavery, even without the activities of slavery, the actions of slavery. So what's the case? So we know that there is a situation that if a woman is married, halachically, Jewishly, religiously, civilly is married, but then has a child from a man that is not her husband, that creates a mamzer situation. That's the what's called the mamzer. Right? Mamzer is sometimes bandied about, a bastard child out of wedlock. That's not halachically true. The idea of using mamzer kind of as a Yiddish, insult, that has taken off and is used in discourse. It's not considered a good word to call someone a mamzer, but halakhically, technically speaking, it's when a woman is married but has a child from a different man that's not her husband, and therefore that child is a mamzer. Now the mamzer is not allowed to marry anybody, is not except another mamzer, and is technically allowed to marry a convert, but the children are always going to be mamzerim. So if you have a mamzer, that line, that lineage is stuck in that situation forever. So however, there was and for the most part, Jewish law does to great lengths to not investigate, to try and avoid making a mamzer determination. We try to use leniencies. We impose different doubts. The idea that, for example, you could take, DNA testing that may prove that the paternity of the child is not the father. We're not interested in that. We don't want to create mamzer situations. We want to avoid mamzer situations. But what happens if you have a bona fide mamzer situation? And so there was an issue that came up, and it was something that was addressed, several times I would call it in recent history, not yesterday, but certainly over the last couple hundred years, the situation, had come up, and it was, I guess in the last 50, 60 years it was revisited. And the situation was, is there any practical way today to have the child of a mamzer no longer be a mamzer? So the case was the response that we're looking at is Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch, who was from South Africa, and then the Eidah Haredis recently passed away. And you have a situation where there's a mamzer is born, and is there any way out of the situation? So the only way to kind of remove the mamzer from the offspring in this case, that Jewish law discusses, Talmudic law raises this idea, is for the mamzer to marry a shivcha Kananit, a non-Jewish slave, because non-Jewish slaves, when they enter into the ownership of the Jew, begin the conversion process. And while they're serving their Jewish master, they have certain expectations of Jewish lifestyle. Technically speaking, a non-Jewish slave is not supposed to be freed, but when if the non-Jewish slave is freed, they amplify and certify and complete their Jewish status process, and they convert as Jews. So non-Jewish slave begins the process of Judification, and if they are free, they become full Jews. And there's a discussion in Jewish law about the owner's ability to marry, quote unquote, or at least have a relationship that produces offspring with the non-Jewish slave. And the suggestion the way to remove the stigma of mamzer is a mamzer has a non-Jewish female slave, has a relationship with her, has children with her, frees the slave, and the children convert, and the children are no longer branded as mamzer. And so that is the pathway. So all fine and good, except nowadays there's no slavery. So the question was raised: what if we're not going to utilize or impose servitude, but let's say we just want to call someone a slave for the sake of going in this direction, to utilize this convoluted process to remove the stigma of mamzer. So what if we want to do something like that? We're not going to have any bills of sale, and we're not going to have any. We're not going to make the person do any work. We just want to kind of use the name, the concept, in order to go in this direction. So this was a big back and forth. Rabbi Sternbuch quotes the fact that it was a big back and forth from rabbis from previous generations. The fact that slavery is forbidden. This isn't going to be slavery. You're just going to use the term slavery. And as sympathetic as the case is, that we want to try and remove, we wanted to remove the stigma of mamzer, we still run up against the dina d'malchus dina, and the act of even declaring the person a slave when slavery is completely illegal is a problem. And he says, so his English conclusion is English on the bottom of source 10. In any event, we ought not to break fences, make radical innovations in matters involving family relations. Never heard of our ancestors resorting to such a procedure, even though the mamzer would be able to save his progeny from the taint of mamzer forever. We want to, but we can't. We want to remove the stigma, but we have to, as much as we want to say this isn't really slavery, we're not breaking the law. When it comes to family issues, where it's too controversial, too much heat to get involved, we don't want to do it. Look, when it comes to family law, we know that Jewish law ends up being much more strict and exacting in terms of the witnesses that are required to have the wedding, and then in terms of the get, in terms of that process. Here, it is to release or remove a stigma, but there's still this caution from doing it. And one could say it stands at that there seems to be a respect for secular law that you don't always encounter in the halachic system. That you sometimes the halachic system, we know that when it comes to dina d'malchus dina, whether the law of the land is actually the law is binding in all situations, is a larger discussion in halacha. We know where the conclusion is, both in terms of halacha and in terms of perception and Jews doing the right things. But often there's a desire to follow the Jewish law, right? The case a couple of years ago where the men were arrested for beating the get refuser. Right, we want the guy to give the get, and the Jewish law allows it, and federal law says no. But in this case as well, what's the big deal? Brand the person a shivcha kananis, have the children free, remove the stigma. But still, we don't go in that direction. It just seems that when it comes to this idea of eved, both in terms of the Hebrew eved, which is viewed as a very kind of a last resort situation, which we are quick to eliminate from applicability when there's no yovel, extends to this idea. Look, there's a certain distaste for slavery. The way the halachot of the Jew owning a non-Jewish slave are very much to at least strived for the dignity and the support as much as possible of the slave, as strange as that sounds. But we're not. We seem to be very quick and easy to remove any connection to slavery, both Hebrew and Gentile. And this situation remains one that this suggestion remains one that was not adopted or implemented as much as we may want to do so. Questions or comments? Okay.